Thanks, James. Appreciate the very kind introduction. Another American bringing the latest developments of technology to you. That's just me being an arsehole. So I've been thinking a lot recently over the past 6 months or so about all these different areas, and I think the thing that RedMonk does that makes it really interesting as a company. When I started two years ago, one of the reasons I joined was, this idea that there's so much to learn from other disciplines just by combining them, by thinking about what are these people already doing, that if we just did that over there, it would make life so much better for us. And that's one of the roots of sort of the whole DevOps movement that's happening right now. The same thing is happening in data science, the same thing's starting to happen in design. And so I do a lot of thinking, but I also try and support that thinking because I am a scientist by nature, with some actual data and some real research, whether it's my own or just going out and reading some books and trying to support it with other people's research. So this talk is kind of about some of my thoughts in the area. What happens when you start mixing all these different things together? What do you get out of it? And then what can we actually learn from places that are very different from where we spend our day-to-day lives? And so as you know, I'm not going to spend much time on this stuff, but with RedMonk, everything comes back to developers. That's really the heart of what we're all about as a company. And it's a very broad definition. It's not just people writing code on a daily basis. It's people who are sysadmins. It's people who are data scientists, whatever that means, people who do DevOps, whatever that means. And we could argue about all these definitions for a while, but I don't want to get into that. But the point is, developers are sort of at the center of this. And so we're going to walk through this thought experiment of what happens when you put the developers in the heart and you mix some things together. What do you get out? It doesn't make things any better. I'm just going to skip that. And James already sort of spoiled that. So the key point here, though, is everything is converging. Everything's coming together. You see it both on the hardware side with, I've got my phone, one little device like this. Of course, it cost me 400 quid. But it does everything that I had to carry around 5 devices for just a few years ago. The same thing is happening, with people, with software. Everything's coming together, and it's, on one hand, very interesting. On the other hand, it's forcing us all to become this sort of Renaissance man or Renaissance woman where you're an expert in everything at the same time. And that's just not realistic. But what is realistic is building a team of people who all have different sets of expertise and combine into something that is the Renaissance team, right? And that team can be good at everything, even if the individuals aren't. And I apologize for this being a little bit lower down on the slide. You just have to stand up in the back if you can't read it. But so let's put developers at the center, because we're RedMonk and that's what we do. You start mixing some stuff together, put operations, design, and data in 3 of these different circles. And what happens if you take developers, throw them into ops? What happens if you take developers, throw them into design? What happens if you take developers, throw them into data? Or vice versa. Take statisticians, take people who do ops on a daily basis, take designers. And I'm loving this today because there's tons of actual designers here, which I really appreciate, because one of the things James didn't mention is that before I did science, I did journalism. And specifically, I did copy editing and page layout. So I spent a lot of time, actually doing design myself back in the days before I did the science and before now I did the tech. And on the side, I've tried to maintain that to the extent I can, but it's great being at this job now where I somehow get to do all of these things that I never thought would come together. So I'm actually living this Venn diagram myself. In that, I get to write, I get to use data, I get to keep writing code because I've been doing open source stuff on the side for the past decade or so. And of course, the open source project I work on is Gentoo Linux, which is famous for being a pain in the ass to administer. And so I get to do plenty of the ops as well. So I'm going to make this super complex, do exactly the opposite of what Theo said yesterday, and start you up by just throwing you right in the thick of things. Let's just put it all up there, and then we're going to kind of go back and walk through it a little bit more slowly. But so you start adding these things together, and you get some very interesting consequences, especially when you look a little bit more deeply. I'm going to spend most of the time today talking a little bit about DevOps and what I see happening there. We can have a bit of a conversation. Feel free to interrupt me because I haven't really planned out how long this talk is going to take. I can take as long or as short as you want it So if you have questions, just interrupt me. I'll repeat them to make sure the video gets them and so on. But what happens when you mix these things? What happens when you extend these things? And so you look at this diagram, and I put under each one of these areas, what happens when you start bringing developers into the mix? But then, if you reach a little bit farther out, look past the circles, what happens when you try and generalize that, try and do what Greg was talking about yesterday from Stripe? What happens when you abstract these concepts to, instead of the developer level, to the business level? And this is where I personally find it really interesting because, of course, I read books about it. And I just find the idea is very powerful, and that's, I think a lot of the things we've been talking about at Redmonk for the past 10 years are starting to happen in a lot of software companies. But what's been much slower to happen is the business level changes, right? If you spend time talking about DevOps, some people say, hey, DevOps is just another word for sysadmin who runs Puppet or Chef. But then at a different level, maybe it's about organizational change, which is a much slower process, but also much more powerful if you get it right. So just start walking through this a little bit. And I'm going to focus on DevOps in part because yesterday you already heard from Cloudera about data science, and so I don't need to repeat that. So what is DevOps even about? Well, that depends on who you ask. One thing it's about is certainly infrastructure as code, and thinking about this idea of let's bring some practices from software development to the operations side, using tools. And the thing that amazed me, y'all familiar with CF Engine? Heard of it? Yeah, it's what came before Puppet and Chef. Remember those good old days? CF Engine 1.0 was released in 1993, 20 years ago, which was incredible to me when I think about it. I mean, configuration management has been around for a long time, even in the open source world. Of course, it was started back in the 1950s by the Department of Defense in the US as an idea. But even in open source, it's been around for 20 years. And that does just kind of boggle my mind, because I think back, and the mid-90s, I'm not old by any means, but the mid-90s still feel like they just happened. And thinking, wow, that's 20 years ago. 20 years we've been thinking about configuration management in the open source world, and most of us still aren't doing it. Like, how long does it take for these concepts to get to people? But then, more recently, there's been this resurgence, driven, I think, in part by things like cloud, where suddenly everything is ephemeral. It appears, it disappears. I mean, that's driving a lot of technological changes. I think it was 2005 Puppet came out, 2009 Chef came out. The past couple of years, we've seen Salt and Ansible emerge, just because of the transient nature of all the resources now. People are looking for faster solutions that can deal with things that appear, that disappear, that scale up, that scale down. The one thing that's really interesting about this, though, is how few standards are involved. Almost all of these are just built on, let's call them ad hoc standards, right? Just technology that works. It's not going through some big standards body to say, hey, let's determine what Puppet modules should look like. Let's send that through Oasis and get it approved. Because the fact is, it would probably still be sitting there in the standards body today, even 8 years later. Another thing that I think DevOps is about is monitoring. And the two really key points about this is, one, configuration management and monitoring are both things that sysadmins care about. For the most part, they're not things that developers give a shit about. And that's why I think people use DevOps as just a synonym for sysadmin in a lot of cases, because these things are things that sysadmins deal with on a day-to-day basis, and that's why they spent so much effort working on them. And feel free to disagree with me now or afterwards, but this is my story and I'm sticking to it. And again, Nagios, it's like the classic open source monitoring tool, released, again, in the 90s. 1999 is when Nagios came out. It's infamously ugly for graphs. It's very difficult to configure and work with. A lot like, certainly like CF Engine was before version 3. I haven't played with it recently. But that's why there's been this sort of resurgence, because sysadmins are starting to get into programming and into coding and saying, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could think about design and get some good design, some good tools that were fun to use instead of that were just a pain. Because, if you're getting paged at 3 a.m., your life is difficult enough already. You don't need to be dealing with 20 pages worth of graphs that just look terrible. And so you've got this sort of resurgence of tools like Sensu, which is sort of a replacement for Nagios. You've got, and Graphite, actually, you can get a lot of these just by looking at the logos of what the design is going to be in the software itself. And because there is essentially no logo for Nagios or for Graphite, and if you look at their UIs, they both just look, well, they reflect the logo, let's put it that way.
Nagios logo is better than the Nagios UI.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's a little bit ragged. Graphite's the same way, although what's interesting about Graphite is it's kind of a two-piece thing. One is the UI, but the other is the time series database. And the database is still around. People love that. But they just ignore the fact that it also has a UI capability. Try and pretend that part doesn't exist. It's one of those great old pixelated graphs with lots of lines and way too much information on the graph for what you want to get out of it. But instead, you've got people like Jason Dixon, who sort of started up this whole monitoring sucks movement, and then figured out, wait, that's not going to be productive if all we do is get together and bitch about stuff. Why don't we try and replace it with better tools instead, and say, hey, we could love monitoring if it looked right. And so he wrote a tool called Tassio, which is those pretty little green graphs there. He's got a couple other tools, some of which look better than others. But one of the things that's really interesting about this is a lot of these new tools are not emerging from traditional software vendors. Instead, they're emerging from the people who need them because the vendors have failed them. The vendors don't understand what it's actually like in a lot of these companies where they're dealing with new things, they're trying to scale in ways that haven't been done before. Etsy is one example. Tassio, I think Jason wrote, let's see, it was pre-GitHub. But anyway, he's worked at GitHub, he's worked at Dyn, a number of companies that have nothing to do with monitoring other than the fact that they're running an IT shop. Yeah. Which apparently sells some excellent software, and I highly recommend them to you. If you missed out on the Cloud Summit a couple days ago, you should have been there. We had this great meme going around of they're a partner and we love them. Good. Yeah. If I don't know if DC's talk was on video, but you should hear him give it some time. It's great stuff. But so on one side there's monitoring, on the other side there's log management. And again, there's been this sort of resurgence in design and in thinking about these things in a way that actually makes them a friendly experience instead of, not just waking up at 3 a.m. but also fighting your way through the software. So you've got, Sensu, Tassio on one side. On the other side, you've got Logstash. Look at that logo, that little log with the mustache on it. Isn't that great? I mean, you look at that and you're like, this is going to be some fun software to use. And I mean, depending on your definition of fun, it is. Kibana, it's got a nice pretty picture in the background. There's some bamboo. Greylog 2 actually is an interesting one because they very recently just changed everything to be all corporate and sell to big companies or something. It was a huge bummer because I went to their site to go get a screenshot, and it used to be this gorilla, and it was called the Party Gorilla. I think it was from the Oatmeal comic a few years back. But then I went there and they just went all corporate, and now they've got letters and braces and brackets and, sort of faceless, blurry pictures of people having fun with computers. So that was kind of a bummer, but I'm informed that the spirit still exists inside. And then, if you've got more money than time, there's Splunk, which is also a very nice looking tool. Does what it needs to do. You look at DevOps today, and a lot of people think, okay, DevOps means sysadmin. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But then on the other side of the story, if you talk to developers, they don't really say DevOps, but they're still sort of doing the same thing, just coming from a different direction. And instead, and again, feel free to argue with me on this if you want to, I think, and what I see is they're looking at things from the opposite direction, thinking about things programmatically. How can I program this? How can I talk about things like CI? Give me the API for this stuff. Give me an SDK for it. People coming from the ops world, they don't care about that stuff. I mean, they might care about it if they're on the release management side for CI. The other stuff, they're like, yeah, whatever. I don't care about it as SDK. I just do everything in Emacs anyways. Maybe if there's a mode, I'll use it. But it's a very, very different world. And what I find interesting is they're living in almost the same place. But they don't see each other. They pretend each community doesn't really exist. And one of the places where I think the split is very clearly defined is at data stores, where you've got people optimizing for developer experience or people optimizing for production experience. What is it like to create and build with this stuff versus what is it like to run this stuff? So on one side, you've got people choosing things like Mongo and like Redis. As was asserted yesterday, not many people run large Mongo installations without occasionally losing some data, which doesn't go over very well with the ops. As it turns out, they're not thrilled about running a database that loses data. But for a developer, you download it, you unpack it, you throw some shit into it. It works, right? It works great for development. Redis very similar. On the other side, you've got some, and I'm getting some gray in my beard as well. You've got some old gray-bearded sysadmins, some old weathered faces, whether it's men or women, doesn't matter. But they say, look, just give me a relational database. It works. They've been around for decades. You can sort of munge your data to fit into it somehow, even if it's not a perfect fit. Get your job done. It's tradition, it's inertia. And even if you're talking about key value, memcached, it works. It does stuff. Redis is a little bit too trendy and new. If you're talking about NoSQL stores, about distributed stuff, they say, oh, you know what won't lose my data? If I have it distributed globally in 5 different data centers. Give me some Cassandra, some React. I don't see many developers choosing that stuff. I wish they did. I don't see it. But so the thing I was talking about, though, is the parallel universes. And a book that I read, again, the book topic keeps coming up, a while back. Unfortunately, it's not very clear on the slide, but a book by China Mieville, British author, so I thought you might appreciate it a little bit, is The City in the City. And it's a story about 2 cities in the same geographic location whose residents are trained from birth to ignore the residents of the other city. They literally live in overlapping geographies, walk by each other daily, and pretend the other side doesn't even exist. I was sitting there thinking, maybe over a beer or two, about this whole DevOps and cloud thing, and it seems like the same thing is happening. People are living in the same world, coming from different directions and not talking to each other. I go to a lot of conferences, and when I show up at stuff like DevOps Days, I see a lot of ops. And they call it DevOps. I don't see a lot of people who are developers. There's a few, probably from Netflix, because that's got to be the example in every talk about cloud. Maybe Etsy, although even Etsy, how many developers show up for that stuff?
People from core usually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, but it's like Allspa and company and the ops team all owning the DevOps space. Whereas, you show up at AWS reInvent and loads and loads of developers, not so many ops, doing the same thing. They're all, working on ephemeral resources, working in cloud, trying to cope with monitoring, trying to do configuration management, but not talking to each other. And this is, I couldn't help but think of this again, the Princess Bride classic movie, if you haven't seen it. The word DevOps, nobody knows what it means. The people who want to own the word disagree with the rest of the world using it. And at the Cloud Summit the other day, I put up a bunch of job descriptions of people hiring DevOps engineers. You know what they're hiring? They're all hiring sysadmins. They're not hiring DevOps engineers, they're just going with the marketing. The word itself becomes meaningless. It's started to be much like cloud washing, where you say cloud, and what is a cloud even anymore? It's just, I go to a website and it's all cloud. Where it's starting to be the same way with DevOps, where does DevOps mean organizational change? Does it mean sysadmins? Does it mean I'm using configuration management? Does it mean monitoring? Loads of disagreement, but I want to kind of wrap up the topic. So, my opinion of DevOps is agile development brought through to production. That's what I think it is. And it turns out I was actually reading, have you guys heard of Damon Edwards before? Yeah, excellent guy, has done DevOps stuff for a long time. I recently saw a video from him talking about sort of the history of the DevOps movement. Turns out it went back to I think it was the Agile 2007 or 2008 conference, where it was Andy Schaefer, one of the founders of Puppet, who ran a BOF called Agile Infrastructure. And I was so intrigued to learn that this movement that now, to many people, means sysadmin who runs Puppet or Chef, goes back to an Agile software development conference. And that was very gratifying for me because I was like, oh, I was onto something here. I actually did understand this thing and came back to the roots of it. Now, things have gone in all kinds of crazy directions since then, but that's where it all started.
But no one showed up.
Yeah, well, Patrick showed up.
Yes, well, Andy didn't even
Yes,
show up.
Patrick DeVos showed up. Andy wasn't there because everybody had ripped on him all day for like Agile infrastructure. That's not going to work. That's just a terrible idea. So he didn't show up for his own BOF, but Patrick showed up and later tracked him down, and then it turned into this great franchise. Now, another thing I want to talk about is, so what happens if you mix design into it? And how am I doing on time, by the way? So I've been talking, I'm great, perfect. So if you mix design in with development, I think you get something else very interesting. And you know, what I'm seeing is, it used to be that you've got the development team over here, you've got the designers over there, and never the twain shall mix. But it's very different now. And you know, you think about it, everybody is dabbling a little bit somewhere, right? Everybody wants to learn a little bit more than they used to, and I think where it's happening probably the best is in the world of web development, where you've got a lot of designers who are now, you know, learning some CSS, maybe learning some JavaScript. You've got a lot of web developers who were previously locked only into the front end, who now, because of Node, are able to become, for some definition, a full stack developer. And it's been very empowering, and it's you know, I think brought a lot of new characteristics to each side, where you've got developers who are thinking about design in a way they weren't before. I mean, just look at the Logstash logo, right? That beautiful log with a mustache. That's design, and that's yeah. Hey, I've done design. It's beautiful. It's charismatic. There's no despair involved though, which means it's not a good enough story. But the despair came first, and Logstash came in and resolved that despair for you. But you know what? Everything is blending. Everything's coming together. You've got the spectrum in a way that you didn't used to. And this is actually, I don't know if you can read all that stuff or not. It doesn't matter because it's up on the blog. You can go check it out whenever you feel like it. So I said I was going to provide some data, and here it is. I went and did some number crunching on all of the languages on GitHub over time, looking at which language GitHub classifies a repository as, which is just whatever has the most lines of code in the repo.
So
Yeah.
many of them are bootstrap styles.
Yes. Many. But on the bright side, it doesn't count forks. This is only newly created repos. So yeah, maybe they got a bunch of template code in there, but it is not like 10 million forks of jQuery for JavaScript, for example. So I went looking back, looked at all the repos classified as CSS to try and get an idea of what are non-coders, or at least people who are, you know, vestigial coders using GitHub for. Is there design activity happening there? And things have just been going nuts. This is the past year, and it's gone up by something like, what is that, about 13x?
You need to control that because...
Yeah, I know. I haven't controlled for global growth of GitHub, which is not that large by any means. And I've got that data, and it's just not in this presentation. It's on a different graph, where I had loads of fun about a year ago predicting what GitHub growth would look like, playing with all kinds of different modeling stuff. Predicted, and I was really thrilled about this. I predicted, let's see, it hit 3 million users last January, or was it December? I predicted to the month when it would hit 4 million and 5 million users. And the 5 million just happened back in December, and I was, you know, had a little celebration, had a pint of beer, put out a blog post that said, I did it! I predicted one thing this year, and I nailed it. So now I've got to come up with some kind of prediction for next year, or just not talk about it again, because that's what analysts do, right? You make 20 predictions, you talk about the one that worked. Nostradamus style. But designers and developers are becoming closer and closer, and that's, I think best indicated by the fact that there's design happening in code on GitHub, and we can quantify it. So I'm going to start sliding along a little bit faster here. The third trend is data, right? You talk about data science. We heard yesterday about that, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it. But it's absolutely becoming much more of an integration with developers, and it's one world reaching out to the other world. They're both happening, right? You've got developers becoming data engineers. You've got statisticians becoming data scientists. I don't want to argue with you about the semantics, but you can see these two worlds starting to interact. Although, it's kind of like the DevOps movement, where I think there isn't as much interaction as there could be, although they're doing very similar tasks. You've got people building Hadoop infrastructures. You've got people doing black box versus white box machine learning. And they're coming from different worlds trying to do the same thing, but not talking to each other because they each have this lack of respect for the other's missing expertise. Right? You've got engineering saying, oh, you statistician, you can't write real code. Just go back to MATLAB or something. And then on the other side, you've got all of these data scientists saying, you guys don't understand how to deal with numbers. You're doing these calculations, you don't know what the results mean. But it turns out, sometimes there's just practical wins, and you don't always have to understand the results. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this stuff because, we heard plenty about it yesterday. I just wanted to put some more data up here for you because I do quite a bit of database research. And, this is, again, just another indication of the integration where you've got data analysts choosing more and more programming languages versus graphical environments. You've got them, going with things like Python and R, and on the other hand, you've got MATLAB and SAS kind of going downhill because you've got a lot more engineers getting into this world. But what's interesting, and this is a survey data that somebody else did because we don't do a whole lot of surveys. You can't find these people. And this is another thing where you can build a team of well-rounded people all together, but trying to find the one person who is this sort of unicorn that does everything just isn't worthwhile. You just can't hire somebody who's a data scientist, so maybe you're better off hiring somebody who's just a scientist or somebody who's just a software engineer. And you can build this collaborative team of, if they don't know the answer, they can go ask the person 2 seats over. You don't need to have one person who knows everything. Let's flip through a little bit of stuff. But now where it starts to get a little more fun for me, at least, just sort of thinking through this Gedanken experiment, is what happens when you start mixing all these things together, right? You get things like, what about ops experience, We've been talking about developer experience for a while now. What about the ops experience? What is this stuff like to actually run in production? And even the companies that have really nailed developer experience a lot of times have really fallen over in the ops experience. I mean, Mongo is actually a great example of this. Wonderful to run for developers, but you try and put that thing in production and run a cluster worth of it and keep it from losing data, and it's just miserable. Whereas, I heard a great talk from the Stack Exchange folks who run Stack Overflow about how they've built all of their software such that it's optimized for the ops. But the problem is, how do you optimize for everything at once, right? You sometimes have to pick and choose which one matters the most. And I don't have the answer to that question. But then, you mix all these different things together. You mix design and data, and unfortunately, sometimes where you end up is Google, where you're optimizing for 78 shades of blue. But there are ways to do it well. Now, that was actually my last slide, isn't it? And I should stop talking. I'm just going to stop now. I'm going to stop.
Stay
Thank
done.
you.
Yeah, those grand unifying theories. Scientists will keep on trying for them, right? There's some superstring in there somewhere. Yeah, we got a question back there from Zach.
I haven't gotten gravity in there yet. Working on it.
Repeat the question. It has to be said, I'm glad you didn't just say, come on, learn closure, which is the answer I would have expected you to give. But.
So the question is basically, how do you build a practical interdisciplinary team, right? If I understand it.
Maybe just like one step into the practical. How do you build this interdisciplinary team?
I think, at the starting point is where you do sort of require the Renaissance people who are a little bit, more of the big picture, where they at least know enough about the other world to appreciate where they're coming from and to evaluate whether they're talking to somebody who knows their stuff. And that's why, you look at the kinds of people who end up working at startups versus working at a big company like IBM, and a lot of times they're much more of the sort of developer evangelist, right? Very, very wide, can do all sorts of things, an expert in a few of them. Whereas, if you've got 400,000 people at your company, you can really become a specialist. So I think it's, to start the teams, you have to have somebody who is a bit broader, who at least knows enough to be able to say, I'm hiring somebody who knows their stuff and can teach me, and I understand just enough to evaluate whether what they're teaching me is real.
Coffee.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, I think it's that time.
Thank you. Sorry for talking so long, but I just kind
No, that
of
was
got
awesome,
lost
Donnie.
in my Venn diagrams.